right, Darren, good to have you. Welcome to Cassandra.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So, Darren, you have been named by CNBC, I think the Oracle of Remote. You have been the head of remote at GitLab, which is quite a sizable company for a long time. You wrote the handbook there that, a course on Udemy or Coursera came from that. It's now the Bible for managers who look to, get their company kind of remote ready, so to say. And you're also a Guinness record holder. I'm not sure what this is about. I thought you wrote like a lot of blog articles, I think, at the time. So anything that I kind of like, missed here?
No, I think that's a pretty good list on the professional front. On the personal front, I'm an adoptive dad. That makes up the core of my identity stack. I'm a million miler on Delta. Love flying around the world on Delta. And yeah, just try to be the best son, husband, and friend that I can on the personal side.
Before we hit the record button, we quickly talked about that, you adopted this remote life or, create value outside of your physical location, like for a long time. And you're a big believer in it. And to be honest, it seems that in this remote work community, or a lot of people that have been writing about it, have been doing research on it, have been living it, it is quite clear that remote work is here to stay. And still, I would say a lot of people, like when I talk to people here in Asia or even, back in Europe, like we are still at the point right now where we are just going hybrid. We are coming from this pandemic and we don't know really, is this like a structural trend, or many people kind of still doubt it? What would you tell them? Or in other words, do you think we already won? Is remote work really here to stay? Is the structural trend? And, is the future and the present already remote?
If you had a machine that could run an evaluation or a model of what the world would look like over the next 100 years, and you ran this 100 times and you saw like, what is the likelihood of something happening? People do this with retirement calculators, right, for example. If you were to do that through the lens of distributed work, how much of it do you think would say, or how many of those cycles do you think would say, we're going to be in a less distributed working world versus a more? Right. The truth is, this movement was already happening before COVID. COVID massively accelerated it, but we're not going to see this turn back and go the other way. Mankind invented the internet. We have figured out a way to achieve knowledge work in a distributed fashion. And broadly speaking, if given the choice, people will always choose the path of most agency, most freedom. And at its core, distributed work enables a level of agency, autonomy, and freedom that is not possible in the old way of working. And even on the employer side, it enables a level of durability and resilience that was not possible before. For companies that lean into this, it enables them to decouple the results that they drive from a piece of physical geography. From a de-risking standpoint, this is quite significant. Have we won? Depends on your definition of won, but I would say largely yes. And here's what I mean by that. It's not that remote work as an operating model has to completely consume all other operating models for victory to be achieved. If you dial back the hands of time just a few years ago, there were really only two paths for people to work. You had to be fully in the office, so at the behest of the employer. You have to deal with a daily commute. You may have to uproot your family, move to a place that you did not even choose in order to be a part of the workforce. Or you may get fortunate and you could find a hybrid type of scenario where an organization would tolerate you working from a different location, but it was never optimized for that. Now we have a de facto third lane. There are a host of organizations that have been born 2020 and onward that don't even think of this as the contrarian path. They were just born into an officeless world. This is their default. And if you were to tell them, oh, your team is working remotely, they would actually have to think about it, because to them, they're just working. And so what I see is there is this upstart movement, this clean break with organizations that don't have the tech debt or the legacy of having real estate and the office modalities around it. And the further we get from that, the longer those companies have to incubate, and you'll start seeing this movement from kind of the bottom up, is my prediction.
And for people who might be not so, be easily convinced, and you would, because I think the employer perspective is quite important. I think, like, if you look at all surveys, it's quite clear that people like remote work and that people like freedom, or, just let's call it work, because we want to think like 5 years ahead, right? So what are the features that you see make companies that work in this, distributed fashion so much more efficient? So we have the global pool of talent that probably comes to mind, documentation, so centralizing knowledge, and async. So can you maybe add some features, and maybe elaborate a little bit, what makes these features so powerful?
I'll back up a bit and give some context before I get into that. It is much more challenging for an organization to see remote work for what it is, which is an operating model treated like a product, compared to what a lot of organizations want to treat it as, which is a policy or a perk. If you just see it as a human resource policy, you can probably hammer out that policy in a week and say, it's done. There's our work from home policy. Let's move on to the next thing. But what you should actually do is recognize that if this is an operating model, we have to audit our entire tool stack, our workflows, even our values and culture, and ask ourselves, do these things still work when one or more people are not at the central office? That's a taller task. And that's why you see a lot of organizations hemming and hawing or asking people to come back to the office, because they've run this analysis and they've determined it's simply too difficult. They don't want to put in the effort to re-architect their entire operational mainframe. Think about a company as an operating system, lines of code. Many organizations had a bit of a patchwork code to begin with, but they use the office as the communication patch.
Yeah.
Correct. And in the absence of the office as a central pillar, now their code looks incredibly buggy. Communication falters, culture falters, you name it. And so the quick fix is get everyone back into the office. The right fix is let's just rewrite the entire code base. So I say all of that as context. And if you can get an organization to swallow that and recognize that the future requires a rewrite, the benefits are numerous. I mentioned the resilience and durability. There's an incredible efficiency that comes from being able to source top talent from anywhere in the world, instead of who can you find either in a commutable distance to your office, or who can you force or persuade to move, which, by the way, has become much more difficult post-COVID because people simply have more remote options than ever before. And also, when you think about around-the-clock businesses, a lot of companies are multinationals now. And if you're able to strategically hire people around the sun, pair them with an incredibly robust knowledge base so that they optimize for knowledge retrieval versus knowledge transfer, which is the old way, you're able to run a much more efficient business. But of course, this requires a re-architecting. It's here that I'll mention, if a company is embarking on this, they should hire a leader to steward it. Think about any other thing that matters in a business. We care about revenue, we hire a chief revenue officer. We care about communications, we hire a chief communications officer. Distributed work, especially if you weren't already distributed, is a massive, massive shift. It's not as simple as saying, hey, everyone can work from home. We're going to keep all of our workflows the same. To do this properly, you really have to rewrite a lot of what makes your organization tick.
How optimistic are you that people, or that companies, traditional companies that have been, office first companies can make this shift? Or is it more like, okay, I should be probably like less bullish about traditional companies and should really look at companies that like embrace it from, because if this is like full on restructuring is needed, wow, like for especially larger organizations, it's more or less impossible, and hybrid doesn't work anyway. So we already know that. So how optimistic are you that this change can be made in the, in the first place? Because it seems to be like a full on restructuring of the, of the company, of every process.
The larger organizations will absolutely struggle. And of course, they dominate the news narratives because they're the largest value organizations by market cap, that is. So of course, they dominate the headlines. But where the innovation is actually happening is in the smaller, more nimble organizations that you haven't heard of yet. But you're going to flip on the television or wherever we're at and 10 or 15 years from now, and you're going to see this tidal wave of companies going public. And you're going to look at their filing and it's going to say no physical address. And you're going to think, what is happening here? And what's happening is that the startup class of 2020 through maybe 2025 will, given 10 years or so to incubate, will become this next generation of pioneering organizations. And it's going to seem like an overnight success, but it's actually happening right now. And so my theory is the larger organizations will hem and haw on this. They probably won't be the pioneers in the change. The pioneering is going to come from smaller organizations. And we will hit an inflection point where they have such a massive advantage from access to talent, from how fast they can make decisions because of their codified knowledge, that the larger organizations, which currently have a choice in the matter, will soon be forced by the market to either retool or get left behind. I call this the fax machine moment of the workplace. You don't have to go too far back in time to remember when larger organizations had an entire recruiting department set up around processes devoted to fax machines.
Right.
And then came along Greenhouse and email and the internet. And we laugh at this, but there were discussions from organizations saying, yeah, how progressive do we want to be? Maybe we should just stick with what we know. Let's just stick with the fax machine. I mean, it works after all, and it does for a time. But at some point, any digital first or remote first company will have intrinsic benefits and efficiencies over those who are left behind. Again, think about this as a product. Quite simply, will the new, more innovative technology win, or the old, more archaic technology win? History says the new one will generally have the edge.
No, I'm a CEO now, and in a traditional company. Now, you convinced me. I'm a believer in technology. I see what's going on. I see that the, outsourcing industry is growing. I see like the internet has pretty much, distributed or, dispersed skills at the global level. So you have smart people everywhere. I believe in digitization, which probably remote companies adapt much easier. What should I do? Give us like a little bit of a framework. So probably I need a head of remote. That's for sure. But what else?
You definitely need a leader. Head of remote would be a good start. Process definition comes next. So you have to codify all of the things that are happening in your org. The true secret to this is making the implicit explicit. It is amazing how many organizations still operate based on siloed tribal knowledge that does not scale across time zones. And so solving that is the next piece of it. And then that bleeds into culture, connection, and belonging. But it's interesting that you mention this concept of what should we do? When I recognized in March of 2020 that the pandemic was going to massively change how we thought about work, I was at GitLab at the time, architecting the GitLab remote playbook. And the first piece of material, the first guide that I wrote, once I realized the pandemic was a thing, was not a guide on what to do, but instead a guide on what not to do. For people who are embracing this for the first time, it is actually much easier to wrap your head around things you should not do versus trying to get a PhD in an entirely new organizational model in the blink of an eye. So what do you not do? The first thing is don't copy and paste the office. The worst thing you could do is look at all of your recurring meetings that were in an office and just port all of them to Zoom. You don't think about who needs to be in this meeting. Does it need an agenda? That's the worst thing you could do. And a lot of companies definitely played the copy and paste game. And 3+ years into it, they're recognizing this doesn't feel great. It's like we might be working remotely, but we're not doing it the right way. We're not doing it with intention. And so if you're wrapping your head around this for the first time, I would first suggest look at what not to do, but then absolutely put somebody in charge of stewarding it, and documentation and defining process would be step 2.
And for companies, like when we look at the landscape, and you mentioned already, obviously the change is going to come from smaller organizations that, really adopt this, and for them it's just work, it's just a normal operating system now. What do you think, is the next phase of remote? And I think what I mean by that is right now we seem to be going a little bit backwards with hybrid. When you look at stats in terms of positions, like how many of them are remote and so on and so forth. What's the trigger, the catalyst, the event that triggers the next phase? When do people kind of start to think, oh my God, we have to do it, because otherwise we're gonna be disciplined by the market?
Yeah, I think market forces will always win over the long arc of time. I want to frame it like this. I want to point to a Future Forum survey that was run, I think it was early 2021, and it surveyed a multitude of people, and it found that 3/4 of people or so said that they would highly value the ability to choose their location, so work from anywhere. But that same group of people said, or 94% of them said, but we would much rather have the ability to work at a time that suits us. Right. So said another way, the current frontier of remote work is geographic independence. And for many organizations, we've achieved that. The next frontier of remote work is time independence, which leans into asynchronous ways of working. So imagine a workplace that is not bound by back-to-back meetings or the rigidity of a 9 to 5, which, by the way, 9 to 5 is relative depending on where you are in the world. The next phase of that would be designing work systems such that people can move work forward and collaborate without 2 or more people having to be online at the same time. This is what requires a massive rethinking. And frankly, it's a cultural transformation. So the force that is going to happen is new organizations are built this way. They can't imagine working any other way. And in fact, when you flip it on its head and you think about the office legacy, it is an incredibly inefficient system. It is designed to only work between this hour and only for people that are within this time zone and only for people that can afford to live within a commutable distance. I mean, the list of roadblocks is very long. We've just done it this way because we've always done it this way, which, by the way, is the most dangerous phrase in business.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So my assumption here is that companies who are designed without this in mind will just inherently be faster, and other organizations will have no choice but to catch up. I do want to mention one thing here, though, which is the importance of people in all of this. I think it's easy to go down this rabbit hole and think, well, okay, even if I can systematically figure out how to build a team of people that can move work forward without ever having to be in the same place, is that really a future I want to be a part of? And my response is in-person strategy is just as important as work design strategy, especially for remote teams. After all, we're humans, we're communal beings, we're social beings. The message is you don't have to be together every single day to fill up that social reservoir. It needs to be on some sort of planned cadence. And for many organizations, they're bypassing the budget. They don't want to get everybody together on any cadence. I do think that's a mistake. There is inherent benefit in onboarding together, breaking bread together, maybe kicking off large projects together, intersperse travel and in person, with distributed being the default.
And it flies a little bit under the radar, but I would mention here that the company retreats to all sorts of nice places is at a record high, and also investment in startups making this happen and facilitating these kind of experiences is also at an all-time high and growing very, very quickly. So sticking to the investors kind of like perspective and, you know, providing a framework how to think about this future, right? So we talk a little bit about, okay, how should a CEO think about this? How should we think about a company adopting it or dealing with it? But let's deal a little bit like with the future of how we will live, because I think one of your sentences or quotes, and I'm probably like, you know, gonna butcher this a little bit, but you said like, okay, so remote work is not a new way how we work, but how we live, right? Do you want to kind of take us down this journey a little bit?
Yeah, saying that a different way is it's less about the future of work and much more about the future of living. So what do I mean by that? I think if you fast forward 50 years from now, and there's a historian writing a chapter on this era that we're presently in, the title of the chapter will be The Future of Living. The subplot will be catalyzed by the future of work. What do I mean by that? I think there are larger societal shifts going on that we can't really see in the moment because we're so fixated on how abruptly work has changed that we aren't giving enough attention to how people are thinking differently about redesigning their lives. So almost overnight, for people who can work remotely, you're able to do things like optimize for living in an area with great air quality, relocating to be near your aging parents so they can have in-home elder care versus outsourced elder care. Perhaps moving thousands of miles away to a different continent to be near a medical center that specializes on something that impacts your children. All of these things would have been nice, but totally far-flung just a few years ago. And now, as people can move and take their career with them, it opens up all sorts of different avenues for completely redesigning your life. Quick story here. You may have heard of interior designers or exterior designers if you're buying a new home. I actually think there's a cottage industry to be born on lifestyle designers. There will be a lot of people who just wind up in a remote job for the first time and they think, how do I design this? My list of places I can go is so long, it's overwhelming.
So like the advanced version of a nomad list kind of, right? Is it that the direction that you're going with this? Yeah, okay.
Well, I could see that being a cottage business that comes together with this. But you know, back to the original thesis here. I think if you look at stats like rural depopulation, you look at the past 1 to 200 years at the increase of people moving to major urban centers at the expense of small and mid-sized towns around the world. Many of these places have been gutted. They've become ghost towns. They've lost all of their cultural fabric, all of their economic base. We can reverse that. And I think you will start to see that. Well, not everyone is going to flee from the city. In fact, some people will flee into the city because now they aren't displaced. Now they can afford to live there because the natural flow of people coming and going where they want to be, that's just a healthier way for cities and towns to run.
It's quite interesting because I think right now, and usually the way how I think about it, there will be very interesting second order effects from this. So 2 examples, and then I want to hear your kind of second order effects. I think like towns in Southern Europe are so underrated with such a high life quality, but they had no chance. All the smart young people, they all had to go to London, to Berlin, to these kind of places where the jobs, you know, were, and they had to leave their families and so on and so forth. So I think there's a massive opportunity to, you know, invest in these places, make them digitally savvy, and, you know, combine the best of both worlds. The other thing that I'm very, very bullish on is that for the first time in human history, in my opinion, nation states properly compete for talent. And I think like the visas that you see right now, the nomad visas, and this is just the first innings. It's gonna go down much, much further down the line. And it might be even, really kind of disciplining governments in terms of their own spending behavior, policies, and so on and so forth. So, but that's enough. And now I want to hear yours.
Yeah, I love that. I would focus on education and the future of countries. So we'll start with education.
Mm-hmm.
A few weeks ago, I was fortunate to attend the World Economic Forum Growth Summit. And the attendees there are primarily made up of C-suite executives of large organizations, people who are in academia, and people who control nations. And what I picked out of that interaction was education has had the millstone removed from its neck. What I mean by that is when you can look at education as an avenue to learn about something that could impact the world, the opportunities are so much greater than having to optimize education for your local community that it's hard for even me to imagine where that's going to go. The second part of it is countries. Entire nations have been built thinking, well, we might be able to partner with another nation, but essentially the hand that we're dealt is the hand that we're dealt. But now the world is far more borderless because the ability for economies to merge and for impacts of people who are situated in one location to impact another, the connective tissue is unbelievable. I heard one gentleman there say, we have never been more united from this perspective. Like we are all together in the same room. And that is very powerful when you think about it. If you were to look at the world and in its Pangea state, right? Like no more borders, everyone is together now. That is the possibility that we have with distributed work. And it's going to take some time for a lot of leaders to kind of rethink that. That really requires breaking your frame. But I think if you do that, it actually flows back into education. Imagine the education system in Casablanca preparing the next generation of Moroccans to potentially work in Silicon Valley, maybe without ever leaving home. And this opens up a huge array of new possibilities for countries to work together and for people to have different impacts at different seasons of their life.
How do you see, if I may ask, this is something that I thought a little bit about, is the Western world in politics. There's so much bifurcation going on in terms of right, left, and so on, whatever. Do you think it might be a relief, or in other words, do you think we might see that people vote with their feet, and we might see, I wouldn't call it an exodus, but like definitely a movement, and move to places where they, are getting treated better or where they are treated best?
The way I would put it is people will be more inclined to leverage their mobility than ever before. And a great micro case study in this is in the United States, there's a state called Oklahoma. And within that state, there is a mid-sized city called Tulsa. And before Tulsa Remote, almost no one in the world had heard of Tulsa. But years before COVID, there was this genius idea that if they built a great city for living, so they invested in awesome green spaces, amazing healthcare, great public transit, you name it, then they could incentivize remote workers to live there. Think about the genius of this. Most cities will lobby a company to come in and build a skyscraper for this quick burst of economic activity. But when the people get there, as their careers move on, they're inherently transient. So it's debatable on how steady is that economic impact. Compare this to Tulsa Remote, where they're competing with other municipalities on, well, who can build the greatest place to live. When someone moves to Tulsa in one career and then they get promoted or that evolves, their career is evolving, but they're not moving. And so as the person evolves, Tulsa still benefits. To me, this is an amazing case study in the future of municipal competition. And if you see this on a global scale, I think that's healthy. This is a more fair playing field.
Oh yeah, that's healthy for sure. I mean, like it is obviously that there is a risk. Like, how do you want to play? Like, does every country need to play it? Does every country need to participate? And I think like it seems to me already what I can see, the smaller countries or like small island nations and some others, they are starting to think about this much, much more than the bigger ones, than the major players, the major brand countries, so to say.
It's treated like any other natural resource. The internet has given smaller countries another natural resource. And so how they leverage it, I mean, that's where innovation comes in. I still think it's healthier. Of course, there are risks, but I'm going to choose the freedom of innovation over tight-knit control 7 days out of 7.
For sure. For sure. Darren, before we wrap this up, what question should I have asked you? Is there any kind of trend, any kind of interesting development that you are watching that you think like, oh, we should really kind of pay attention to this?
The key question to ask is, what challenges has society at large or the world at large been dealing with for generations that we may be able to, if not solve entirely, make a significant impact on simply by giving people more control over their time? Where this impacts me personally is I'm an adoptive father, as I mentioned at the top. And I think back on our adoption journey, and it was incredibly seamless and easy compared to some of the stories that you hear. And I think back on that and I think, why was that? I had a flexible workplace. So if I needed to be at a meeting at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, it's really not an inconvenience. I can do my work a little later in the evening, or maybe even work on a Saturday to make up for it. All I had was a little bit more flexibility, but what it enabled me to do is live a fundamentally different life. And so when I look at, well, what was the net impact of that? Well, there's one fewer orphan in the world, and our family is bigger, and all of the blessings that come with that. And so to me, I look at something like the orphan crisis, and I think, how many people are called to foster or adopt? They have the means, they have the home, they have the family support, but they can't fit it into their life around the rigidity of their 9 to 5. If you simply give people more control over their time, they will repurpose that into making an impact on something that has plagued us for generations. This is the one that matters to me, but I am certain there are many other crises in the world that could use the time and attention and cycles of people to which it matters. So my thesis is, if we can get this right, we give people time back, many of them won't squander it. And I think a lot of the things that we're investing tons of resources, tons of money, tons of lobbying into, if we just change the fabric of work and life and the relationship between those, I think it could be a much more efficient way to solve a lot of those issues.
For sure. More sovereignty for the individual. It's a great thing. It's a beautiful thing. Okay. So Darren, before we close here, where can people, apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm Darren Murph.
Thank you so much, Darren.
Thank you.